So when I was a kid, I really enjoyed the old Batman TV show from the 60s. You remember these guys? You know? If you don't remember that show, most would say you're not missing anything, you know? But I liked it when I was a kid, and I learned the definition of a cliffhanger from that show. You remember that? Just as the show was getting good, just as the heroes were about to meet their end and the villain was going to escape scot-free, the announcer would interrupt. What's going to happen to our heroes? Tune in next week, boys and girls. Same bat time, same bat channel. I heard some of you saying that. That's so funny. Turn to Mark chapter 12. I kind of did the same thing last week if you were here. You know, just as the story was getting good, just as we were going to figure out, okay, what does this passage mean for us, you know, in the 21st century, I paused and said, you know, we've just run out of time. Have to look at that next Sunday. And here we are. It is next Sunday now. Mark chapter 12. And so if you weren't here, just in case you missed last week, let me say verse 17, chapter 12, verse 17, which is the verse we're going to be in this morning, is considered one of the most profound things that came out of Jesus' mouth. Sometimes we go through like 20 verses in a Sunday. Sometimes we do part of a verse, and today is one of those days. We're just making our way through the Bible, making our way through Mark in particular, seeing every week, okay, who is Jesus? What did he do? Why is he so incredible? Why did he change lives? And what we're going to look at today is Jesus didn't just change individual lives. He transformed our whole understanding of government. And he did it with these 16 words: render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. It's a very simple statement. It's even poetic in its arrangement, but it's brilliant in its complexity. It's far-reaching in its implications. It's been called the most important insight that shaped the governments of Western civilizations. It's made at a time when government had absolute authority. And in the midst of that, this, like I said last week, was the acorn that became the oak tree of our First Amendment, the separation of church and state, and religious freedom. So, and I want to show you why. Now, today's going to feel a little different than normal sermons because I'm going to be making a case for you. I'm going to be presenting an argument, and each part of it is going to build on the next. And there's a lot of Bible study. We're going to be all over the Bible today. But hopefully at the end of it, you see like, oh, so that's what Jesus is saying in this verse. And that's how this verse can apply to my life. That's my goal. So take a look at verse 17. The first thing I want you to see, like, why is this so incredible? Jesus, with that word "and" in verse 17, creates two spheres of authority. One belongs to government and the other belongs to God. So Jesus affirms that government has a legitimate claim on people, to which every one of us must respond. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. But also Jesus affirms that God also has legitimate claims on people, and all people should respond to God in obedience, render to God the things that are his. So in the context of first century Judaism, the government's existence was not an attack on God, according to Jesus. We have obligations to the government, and those don't conflict with our obligations to God. We have obligations to God that don't conflict with the government. Everyone should obey the law. Everybody should worship God. That's what Jesus is saying. But he's saying more than that, because as you dig into those words, what you find is that, like, how many things belong to God? Look at the last part of that sentence. Render to God the things that belong to God. Well, we saw last week the things that belong to God it's everything, right? So if God has authority over everything, then the authority the government has must come from God. In other words, government authority doesn't come from the government. It's given to the government by God. And I want you to see that this is Jesus' teaching. Keep your finger here in Mark 12 and turn to John chapter 19. It's just two books to the right is the book of John chapter 19. Now, in the context of this passage, Jesus is talking to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. There's a trial. He's on for his life. And in John 19, they're interacting back and forth. There's this intrigue going on with the religious leaders, and there's like, what's going to happen? And Pilate is kind of in the middle. He's not sure what he's going to do. And notice chapter 19, verse 11. To support this idea that I'm talking about, that any authority that government has comes from God, notice how Jesus puts the authority that Pilate has. Chapter 19, verse 11. You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. So the words of Jesus support this idea that I'm saying, that government authority is derivative, meaning it doesn't exist in and of itself in the government. It's given that authority, in this case, by God. And then finally, if you turn back to Mark 12:17, the final thing you need to see about this is that if God's authority, if everything belongs to God, then what that means is that particularly even if the government itself belongs to God, then what that means is that these two spheres of authority are not equal. Which means that what Jesus is saying here when he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that are God, if everything belongs to God, including government, then what that means is government authority is limited. The government is limited because God is the ultimate authority over everyone, including the government itself. Government has authority over its things, like in Mark 12:17, it's the context is taxes. But if Caesar tries to assume authority that belongs to God, like demanding worship, like the Caesars did in the first century, he's now left his sphere of authority. The things that are God's, what a person believes, how a person worships God, for instance, are not under the authority of the government. Ultimate authority in life belongs to God, not the government. Only God, not the state, has total claim on the citizen. So the state must be a servant to God, since God is the rightful owner and source of government. So do you see like all of this stuff that Jesus is saying in just 16 words? He's saying some extremely profound things that were never talked about, things that were never discussed before this. That, first of all, in this context, just to summarize, government authority is legitimate. They can compel people to obey. Jesus says, however, that authority is derivative, it's acquired, meaning it comes from God, it doesn't reside in the government itself. And third, that authority is limited, meaning government must be a servant of God, not a rival to God. Do you see what I mean? Verse 17, simple yet complex, easy to understand, yet profoundly brilliant. And we've really, come to expect nothing less from Jesus, right? Like, this is what we expect from him. He's our great God and Savior. And as God, he is brilliant, and he can take brilliant ideas and make them super simple and yet still blow people away. Like it says at the end of verse 17, people stood back and marveled at him. And you can see why. As you dig into this passage just a little bit, you see just this continuing, it's like a well that just keeps flowing with riches, this passage does. And what I want you to see now is that this passage was picked up by some of Jesus' other followers and expanded. So turn to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. These ideas, these three ideas, that government is legitimate, it's derivative, and it's limited, that these three ideas are then picked up by two of Jesus' early followers, Paul and Peter. Now take a look at Romans 13. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read Romans 13, and I'm going to pause and make some comments while I read to show you the connections between what Paul wrote here, and what Jesus said in Mark 12. So take a look at Romans 13, starting in verse 1. The Apostle Paul writes, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. So right there, their authority is legitimate. You should be subject to it. There is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Again, their authority is derivative. So there's the second point. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And we'll get to that in a second. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. Notice that. He's God's servant, meaning his authority is limited. He's the servant of God. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he doesn't bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Again, there's limited authority. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities, notice, are ministers of God. There it is again, limited authority. Attending to this very thing, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So you see that, just like Jesus, Paul says government's authority is legitimate. They should be obeyed. It is derivative. It comes from God. He says it's instituted, verse 1, by God. Its very existence is. And human government is limited. It's God's servant or minister. In other words, it's doing the will of God when it promotes the right thing to do, when it promotes right and it discourages and punishes the wrong. Whether it knows it or not, it is God's servant in that way. Now turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. So I want you to see Peter picks up the same thing, but he adds a very important part to this that I want us to really focus on here. 1 Peter chapter 2. So it's about 10 books to the right as you move past Romans. 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter's writing to a group of Christians, by the way, who may not have had the best relationship with the government that they were over, that it seems like they may have been the source of the persecution and the difficult times that the people in this church that Peter wrote to are facing. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, how does he encourage them? What does he say to them? Chapter 2, verse 13. He says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. So there it is again. Their authority is legitimate. They should be followed. They should be honored. This is the will of God. Verse 15, this is God's will. This is what God wants. That by doing good, by submitting to the government, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Well, Peter does the same thing as Paul and Jesus, submit to the government, their authority is legitimate. But I want you to notice that Peter adds something significant that we really need to take seriously. Take a look at verse 13 again. Peter adds this very important addition when he says, look at those words, for the Lord's sake. Be subject for the Lord's sake in verse 13. What does that mean? What Peter's doing is he's getting at the motive. Why do we obey the government? And the answer is to honor, love, and worship God. We do it for the Lord's sake. We obey the government as an act of worship to God, just like all obedience is an act of worship to God. So whenever you obey a human authority, you're submitting to God, and when you're submitting to God, you're worshiping him. And it's never because of who they are, and oftentimes it's in opposite. You obey them even when you don't want to. Why? Because when you do that, it makes Jesus look good. And so when we put all of this together, the principle that emerges from these texts is this. In general, obeying your government is worship. In general, obeying the government is worship. Whether it's a good government like Rome when Paul wrote Romans in the mid-50s, or a bad government like the one that may have been persecuting the Christians that Peter wrote to in the mid-60s, early 60s AD, or whether it's a pro-Jesus government like ours has been, or whether it's an anti-Jesus government that eventually kills Jesus like first century Judaism. Verse 17, the expectation for the people of God is the same thing: obey the government. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Romans 13:7 again. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. I really wish it didn't say that, but it does. And that's what I'm saying. It's like, this isn't based on whether or not I agree with this. This is God. And when I obey this, I'm worshiping God. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. Speed limits to whom speed limits are owed. Building codes to whom building codes are owed, fishing and hunting license fees for whom fishing and hunting license fees are owed, seatbelt fastened, protecting all the cacti in Arizona. You know what I mean? Like on and on and on and on. The point here is this: when you put all of this together, I think the argument of the Bible is that as Christians, we should be model citizens of this country, of any country we find ourselves in. That we should be model citizens. The very best of the best, obeying the laws, doing good to our neighbors, using our freedom to serve God and other people, showing honor and loving everyone. We should all be model citizens, because when we are model citizens, it's worshiping God, or another way as I put it, it makes Jesus look good. It makes Jesus look good when we obey the government. But the problem is that history tells us the government always doesn't stay inside its God-given sphere of authority, right? Sometimes it leaves that. Oftentimes it leaves that. Most of the time it leaves that. If we look at history, it's not always a great relationship between God and the government. So how do we relate to the state when that happens? Well, like we saw last Sunday, for instance, the Roman Empire. What were they doing? They were demanding the worship of Caesar, right? They were telling citizens, if you want to be a good citizen, if you want to be the kind of citizen that we promote and that we bless in this culture, you need to obey, not just obey Caesar, you need to worship Caesar as divine. And many early Christians went to the arena saying, we will refuse to ever say Caesar is Lord. And the question then becomes, based on the text that we just looked at, did they do the right thing or were they sinning by resisting the government? Christians struggle with this. If you don't know that, you can just start to read some of the literature on this. Christians really struggle with this question. And so the rest of our time, I think we're just going to kind of look at this question in more detail. And typically, what governments do is they crept into the things of God in one of two ways. They either forbid what God commands, or they command what God forbids. That's how governments start to creep into God. It's creep into the things of God. So we learn something very important, though. And what we learn from the Bible is that government authority is not absolute. And that's what we're going to see through a little Bible study we're going to do right now. Let me say that again. Government authority is not absolute. I know what Paul said, Romans 13:2, if you're still there. He says, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I'm not discounting that at all. And in general, that's true and should be followed. But what happens is that one Bible verse doesn't say everything the Bible has to say about a particular idea, that we take all the passages in the Bible on this subject, and when we put it all together, we learn something very important. We learn that when there's ever a choice between God and government for the Christian, there really is no choice. You always obey God rather than men. So point number 2, the way I put it here, in rare cases, at rare times, on rare occasions, we're not talking about all the time just because I don't like this, but when there is a true conflict between God and government, at rare times, disobeying the government is worship. Disobeying the government is worship. Now, if that's new to you, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to take us through a jet tour of the Bible and show you Old and New Testament, Exodus to Acts. This is a principle that is often applied as examples for us to admire and follow. If you strongly disagree with this, if you're just like, this is wrong and I hate this, my hope is that what I'm going to say here is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of a conversation. My email is on the back of the program. If there's anything I ever say up here that you're like, I don't understand this or I don't agree with this, please email me. I would love to meet with you during the week. I'd love to talk to you about this. If this just doesn't make sense or you just straight out disagree, I would love, I'm not, let me just say this, Acts 17:11, you should have this passage memorized, where it talks about the men of Berea, the people of the city of Berea. They received Paul gladly. They heard everything Paul said. They're sitting there listening, Bibles open, going, okay, Paul, I'm tracking with you. And their response to him was, we receive you glad. We receive what you're saying, but we're going to search the scriptures to see if these things are so. And that's an apostle. Like, that ain't me. I'm no apostle. All right? So an apostle of Jesus, these people said, that's great. I'm going to check the scriptures to make sure. I'm saying do the same thing with what I'm going to say here if the stuff I'm saying here is new to you. So, and if I'm off here, I will come up here next week and say, I was wrong and people confronted me and I'm so grateful for them. Here's where I was wrong. This is my understanding as of now when it comes to the Bible. Exodus chapter 1. As you start the book of Exodus, you remember that the people of Israel came into Egypt about 70, and by the time they left, there are a couple million. So they are increasing in population, and the government authorities see this, and they're going, we don't like this. We need to put an end to this. Now look at Exodus chapter 1, verse 15. So the king of Egypt, remember the king of Egypt is someone who's worshipped as a god. Okay, so he is not just, he's a government official, whatever. He is considered by the people of Egypt as God. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, these are Egyptian people who helped the Hebrews give birth, said to them, one of whose name was Sifra, the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now watch verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did as the king of Egypt commanded them. Is that what it says? Doesn't. Their fear of God forced them to do what? Disobey the God of the planet. King of Egypt commanded them, and they said no. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. That's not even what happened. So God dealt, notice this, verse 20. So God dealt with them harshly for disobeying the government. Is that what it says? So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. He blessed them. Well, what's the only thing we know that they did? Disobeyed the government, lied about it so that God's people could flourish. Is that the only passage in the Bible where something like that happens? No, but what I want you to see is they feared God, and that fear of God led them to disobey. And if disobeying the government is wrong 100% of the time, then the Bible should say they feared God and obeyed Pharaoh. But it doesn't say that. Now turn to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. At this point, the Hebrews are now over 2 million strong, and they have left Egypt, and they're on their way into the promised land. They are on the doorstep of the promised land. The first city in the promised land is Jericho. So, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho. So now notice, who hears about this? Some guy just on the street somewhere? No, it says the king of Jericho. Again, the one with authority in Jericho. He sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who've come to you, who entered your house, for they've come to search out the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said to them, true, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they came from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went, but pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she'd brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she'd laid in order on the roof. In other words, she disobeyed the government, lied about it, and actually diverted the government to the opposite direction. Now look at verse 12. So what happens is she does this for them, and then she's speaking to them, and she says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I've dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. And in fact, we just read that and it's just a description. We just like, okay, well, that's interesting fact, and she is protected, but what does that mean? How are we supposed to understand that? Well, Hebrews 11:31 tells us how to respond to that, how we should understand this. Hebrews 11 is part of the hall of faith, right? It's all of these people who are faithful to God. And you can turn there if you want, or you can just listen. Here's what this passage says about the event that we just read about. It says that Rahab trusted God. She believed God. And, quote, therefore, she did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she'd welcomed the spies in peace. And again, don't miss who she lied to. She lied to the king of Jericho. She disobeyed a command of the king of Jericho. Now turn to Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3, we have a famous passage, a passage that anyone who grew up going to church knows about, and a lot of people who never darkened the door of a church knows about. This is a famous passage, the fiery furnace of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But this is This is an instance, this is an illustration of how we should respond when the government commands something that God forbids. All right? So remember I told you governments either command something God forbids or forbid something God commands. That's how they start to creep into the things that belong to God. Well, this is an instance where idolatry is something that is clearly forbidden by God. So if you don't remember the event, here's what happened. Nebuchadnezzar builds this big statue, and he says, part of the law, everybody's going to worship this. When you hear the sound, when you hear the music, dun, da, 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 you hear it, everybody bows down and worships this massive gold statue. Well, he begins to hear that there's some Hebrews that aren't following his orders, following his law. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So here they are. You can go back to verse 12. There were certain Jews among you who appointed over affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. So he's ticked. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar answers and says to them, is this true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? I'm gracious. I'm a gracious king. If you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. I'll give you one more chance. I'll give you one more chance to obey me. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I must obey the government, right? That's the absolute law of the Bible. You must always obey the government. Verse 26, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. You don't have to play the music and see what we're going to do. We'll just tell you right now, if this be so, if you're going to throw us in that furnace, we're never going to obey you. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Notice, all I want you to notice is that they disobeyed the most powerful man in the world at the time. Now turn to Daniel chapter 6. You see Daniel do the same exact thing. There's a law that's passed. The law is you can only pray to the king for the next 30 days. There's inter-office, squabbles. Daniel's co-workers didn't like him that much, so they're trying to get him, in trouble with the boss. Well, that boss just happens to be king, and that king actually has absolute authority and can kill you if he wants to. And so he writes this decree. He says, no one can pray except to me. You can look at verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction, sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So what's Daniel going to do now? Is he going to give up? Is he like, all right, well, government says it, so I just got to do what it says? When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, in other words, when Daniel knew this was already law, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, notice, as he had done previously. Previously to what? Previously to the implementation of that law. On the upper chamber, doors, windows wide open, praying how many times a day? 3 times a day, as he'd done before. This is an open act of rebellion, for which he's captured. He's thrown into a cave full of lions. And then the next morning, Darius is like, are you okay? You're my friend and I like you, but I got to follow the law. And are you okay? What's going on? And he screams into the cave. And look at verse 21. David says to the king, O king, live forever. I'm alive. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. So I wasn't harmed, but I want you to see what he says here. This is huge. I'm not harmed because I was found blameless. What? He disobeyed the government. I was found blameless before him. Before who? Before God. And also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Some translations say, I have committed no crime. You disobeyed the government. How could that be? 2 more passages I want you to look at. Turn to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. Now we're in the New Testament. Are we going to see the same thing? New Testament is where we have all these passages about submit to the government. And, if you don't, you're in trouble, all of that stuff. Matthew chapter 2. We look to this passage a lot at Christmas time to give us some context, like what was going on. And at the time of Jesus' birth, there were some wise men that showed up from Babylon, and they're following the star, and they talk to Herod. He's the king, and they say, hey, we saw the star of the king. And Herod's response is, well, when you find this king and you go worship him, come back and tell me, because I want to worship him too. Remember, who's saying this? Just some random official walking down the road as the wise men are cruising down? No, we're talking about King Herod saying to them, you guys come back here. Okay? I need to worship him. Look at verse 12. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Well, in chapter 1, when there were dreams, it was a dream that happened for Joseph. What we see throughout Jesus' life in these early moments is that angels were communicating to people God's will. So what are we seeing here? They were doing that through dreams. What we see here in verse 12 is that this dream was either God or an angel on behalf of God showing up to these guys and going, you want to disobey what King Herod said and get out of here. So here's God telling people to disobey a king. Now turn to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, this is after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. He's now on his way. He's left, but the Holy Spirit is here, empowering witness, empowering proclamation, empowering service in Jesus' name. And in Acts chapter 4, the same officials that put Jesus to death don't like what the apostles are doing now. They're going like, you guys are doing stuff that you shouldn't be doing. You're in trouble, and I need to stop this as soon as possible. Acts chapter 4. And so take a look at verse 19. So they're captured, and then these officials, these Jewish religious authorities say, hey, you're not allowed to speak anymore or teach in his name. That's verse 18. And now notice how Peter and John answer. Whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. But for us, we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. So we look at that and we go, okay, well, how's that going to play itself out? It plays itself out by them leaving there and preaching Jesus, disobeying their command. And they, so much so that it's not just like in hushed tones at a little restaurant, or it's not like, that they meet in a house and like, keep them quiet down, Jesus is great. Like, it wasn't that at all. Take a look at chapter 5. And they get captured again. All right, so here they are, and so they're brought before the high priest. And notice verse 27, 5:27. And when they brought them, they set them before the council. Here's Peter and the other apostles. And the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charge you not to teach in this name. That's chapter 4. We told you not to do this. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching. This is everywhere now. And you intended to bring this man's blood upon us. But notice this. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. We must obey God rather than men. So do you see that second principle now? The Bible does not teach unquestioned allegiance to the state. Obedience to the government is not absolute. General obedience, absolutely. Absolute obedience, never. And there's more we could have looked at. We could have looked at Esther. We could have looked at Jeremiah. We could have looked at Micah. There are so many places where we could go where we could see this. Time didn't allow it, but think about it. We admire Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We go, these are men of character, and these are men of courage. But how do we know these are men of character and courage? We forget sometimes that their act of character and courage were acts of civil disobedience against governments that could have killed them. Commanding submission to the authority of the government in Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2 was never meant to make the government God, and was never meant to make anybody treat the government as God. When government forbids what God commands, or it commands what God forbids, we saw civil disobedience, Exodus 1, fears God. Civil disobedience is an act of faith, that's Rahab. Civil disobedience is innocent, blameless, according to the Bible in Daniel chapter 6. Why? Because according to the Bible, we are to obey God rather than men when the two conflict. And notice too, civil disobedience was not hateful. It wasn't harmful to those they disagreed with. There was no rock throwing. There was no violence. There was no mayhem. There was no screaming. There's no guarantee that their civil disobedience was going to be successful either. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, right? I mean, imagine Daniel. I mean, Daniel could be saying to himself, like, there's no reason that God should protect me through these lions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were like, it could happen, he could save us, or he couldn't. Either way, we're not going to bow down. This wasn't because they had some super insight. They're like, oh yeah, okay, well, we're going to do this, but God's going to protect us. Regardless, though, their civil disobedience was unshakable, no doubt, but we saw it was respectful. Just we saw that with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Oh king, oh king, oh king. Even with the apostles, you got to decide, but for us, like, this is what we got to do. It was humble, it was loving. And so for us, we are in a current political climate that is interesting, to say the least. There's a snowball that's been gaining momentum from our government to significantly restrict religious liberty and silence religious points of view. So what do? I mean, there was a time when our government and the majority of our culture agreed with what the Bible said on a lot of issues. Now that's changed. That doesn't mean that we're supposed to change. We're not politicians, right? We don't take polls to find out what we think. Our standard is fixed, and it's been fixed for thousands of years. So like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we should never, ever bow. We will never surrender. Out of worship to our God, faithfulness to his word, love for the very people that disagree with us, we should never surrender. You should resist in ways like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that are unshakable, but also humble and loving, kind and respectful, that doesn't hate anybody. And keep this in mind too, as Christians, we have faced far worse in history than what we're facing in our country now, or beginning to face, I should say. And brothers and sisters in other countries on the planet right now are facing far worse than anything that we're going to be suffering in the next decade at least, probably. So what? Religious freedom, we've enjoyed this significant influence that Christianity has had over every part of our culture for a couple hundred years is unheard of in history. You know that, right? It's never happened before. We like it. We probably got a little bit too complacent because of it. So today is a new day. But if they didn't fold in the past, if our brothers and sisters in other countries aren't folding now, if they're staying faithful, if Christians didn't surrender to persecution and jail and the confiscation of property and forced slavery and crushing taxation and not to mention even torturous death, then you and I shouldn't submit either. You and I should not surrender either. We should never, ever surrender. Caesar should stay out of the things that are God's, but when he doesn't, I'm going to argue, based on the passage we just saw, that it is worship to resist. Because unlike the Egyptian midwives with Pharaoh or Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jesus and Caesar, we in America aren't relating to an absolute state. We're not relating to a state that says, like, you must do everything we say, period. That says, like, we're God and you've got to worship us. Like, we're not dealing with that. Our system is completely different. Our presidents might think it sometimes, but they're not monarchs, right? They aren't judge, jury, and executioner. They're three branches of government, federal, state, and local, so that there's always these checks on power and authority. And in America, the power belongs to who? Belongs to us, right? Belongs to the people. So we vote on many of our laws, or we elect our representatives to enact laws that they say we will, that they talk about, that we say, I agree with that, I'll vote for you. In other words, through direct action, we can do something that almost no one in the Bible got to do. We can actually influence the direction of our country towards God or away from God by direct participation in our government. So for the rest of my time, and I don't have that much, I'm going to argue that obeying Jesus' command in Mark 12:17 to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, but to God the things that are God's, means that every Christian, point number 3, all of us, we should influence our federal, state, and local governments. Every single one of us. Influence your federal, state, and local governments. I don't agree with the view, in other words, that all government is evil. Like we saw, it's been instituted by God. I don't agree that government involvement is polishing the brass on the Titanic. It's all going down, and so it doesn't matter. Government involvement just kind of like takes away from the true reason the church is here, which is evangelism. I don't think either of those views is biblical, and I'm going to show you why. My view is this: all Christians should seek to influence our government according to God's moral standards and God's purposes for government as revealed in the Bible. Nothing I'm going to say right now is original to me. I'm indebted to one of my teachers in seminary for this. His name was Wayne Grudem, for the ideas I'm going to give you here. And if you have questions about this, again, expressions of anger, shock, joy, whatever, my email's on the back of that program. So please, I'd love to talk to you about this. I know some of the stuff we're talking about, like, is this church? Like, what are we doing? This is just where we are in the Bible. Next week will be completely different, and the week after that will be completely different. This just happens to be where we are. And there's a book on the back of your notes called Politics According to the Bible that Dr. Grudem wrote. And I would just recommend reading the first 3 chapters to kind of see, like, here's where I'm coming from. At least I think this is the best argument for what I'm going to present that I've ever read. And it's like 100 pages, and I've condensed it down into about 10 minutes. So good luck for me on that. So how should we seek to influence our federal, state, and local governments? Well, first, every single one of us should vote. Every single one of us should vote. I know there are libertarians out there, and that's fine, but there should never be a reason that a Christian doesn't vote. Every election, almost everything to vote for in an election will influence our country, either in a direction towards God or in a direction away from God. So Christians should seek to influence our governments toward God. Second way that we should influence our federal, state, and local governments is by praying for our government. So last passage, 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. I had you take a look at this passage with your growth groups this week, and so hopefully you did that. But if you're not in a growth group or you just didn't do the questions on the back, take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul writes, "First of all then, I urge that supplication, prayers, and intercessions and thanksgiving be made for all people." It's everybody, but now let's get specific. "For kings and all who are in high positions." Now, why do you want us to pray for them, Paul? What's the benefit for us? Like, why does that matter? Notice that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So you pray for the government so that you can have a good life, so you can have a quiet and peaceful life. But notice, there's an additional piece as to why you should pray. This is good, praying for the king, this quiet and peaceful life. Why is this good? It's pleasing in the sight of our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So not only is it for my benefit as a citizen that I pray for my government, because then I get to, have a quiet and peaceful life, but notice verses 3 and 4, when there's that quiet and peaceful life, that creates the context where our mission can be advanced. That's verse 3. This is good. It's pleasing when life is peaceful and quiet and godly and dignified, because in that context, God, the Savior, reaches out and saves people through us. So I think these are important. Praying for your leaders, voting for candidates and policies and all of that stuff. But I don't think I think that's the minimum. The minimum obligation as Christians, citizens to the United States. The opportunity to be a part of selecting the kind of government we have is a gift and a responsibility from God that's given to us in this country that most Christians in history, and I'd argue probably most Christians on the planet, don't get to do. The next question, though, is this: are there examples in the Bible of greater involvement than just praying or voting or however people made decisions in the past? Are there examples of greater involvement than just praying in the Bible? And the answer is there is. There's a lot of examples, in fact. We don't have enough time to go through them, but just think about this for a second. Joseph had significant influence on Pharaoh. Moses had significant influence on a different Pharaoh. That Pharaoh didn't listen to him like the one listened to Joseph, but he still had significant influence on him. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king of Persia, which was a high position of responsibility, and he did such a good job at his position that when the people were going back to Jerusalem, the king of Persia said, "Hey, Nehemiah, why don't you lead the efforts to rebuild Jerusalem. God placed Esther in Persia to influence its king. Mordecai, her uncle, becomes the vice president of Persia. Many Psalms and Proverbs discuss what a good leader is and does, and discusses what a bad leader is and does. Why is that? Because when people who are leaders read those things, they learn how to be better government officials, for instance. Daniel had significant influence on multiple kings. Jeremiah 29:7 encourages God's people to, quote, seek the welfare of the city. And while that includes lots of things, doesn't it also include bringing good to our government through influencing laws and leadership in the direction of God's word? The New Testament, for instance, think about John the Baptist. He had significant influence on Herod the Tetrarch. He had influence on him. He spoke to him. It says in Luke chapter 3 about all the evil things that Herod had done. Now, his influence cost him his life, but it still shows he had influence. Paul in Acts 24 had influence with a man named Felix, a Roman governor. So he talked to him, Acts 24:25, about righteousness and self-control in the coming judgment. Now, these words, this is not just like there was just a monologue. The words that Luke used here there's a back and forth discussion that lasted for a long time and multiple times. I mean, it's not too far-fetched to think that he did talk about more than just Felix's private life, but also his actions as an official. So all of this shows significant influence by God's people on secular governments and pagan kings even who had no allegiance to God. Now, are there examples outside of the Bible of this, of Christians influencing government? The answer is yes. You can see Christian influence in the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the most significant documents for freedom and flourishing that this world has ever known. Christian influence, massive. Christian influence led to the abolition of abortion and infanticide and gladiatorial games in Rome. It's led to the abolition of human sacrifice in many cultures, polygamy in many cultures, the burning alive of widows in India, for instance, the end of slavery in Britain and America, as well as the granting of property rights and voting rights and other protections for women. The Christian influence has been a massive force for good on the governments where those Christians lived. Martin Luther King was a Christian, and he took biblical principles, Christian worldview ideas, and he did those things didn't just influence his actions. Read his letter from a Birmingham jail. That's just full of the Christian worldview, showing that Christian ideas were impacting the end of segregation and discrimination. Many more examples can be given on the back of your notes again. There are 3 books on there about Under the Influence and Christianity on Trial, and a third one, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? If you read those books, you will be blown away at how much God has used the church and positions of government to change the world and to make a huge difference in the world. And why do we do this? Well, I would argue this way. If Christians don't influence the American government, if we don't speak publicly with our votes about the moral and ethical issues facing our nation, like who's going to do it? I mean, where will people learn right from wrong? From Hollywood? Athletes? Entertainers? Teachers? Co-workers? Okay, fine. But where are they going to learn right from wrong? If Christians don't influence our government in biblical directions through our voting and our speech, then where are the good sources of morality and God's standards that are going to shape our country? If we're silent, it's not like we're silent and then nothing happens. When we're silent, it creates a vacuum. And when that vacuum is created, it's filled with non-Christian and even anti-Christian sources that will influence our government. We may never be able to persuade a majority of people on every issue, but your influence could result in many positive changes in our country, like we've had in the past and will continue to have. See, that's the thing about this. As you read the church history, it didn't matter if the government was for us or against us. It didn't matter if it was good times or bad times. God advanced his will in this world, and it didn't matter simply because Christians said, it is my job to influence my government. And for some reason, we've kind of backed off on that and said, no, our job is just to evangelize and not do that. When we look at church history, and we did that constantly. And it wasn't because we were setting up a theocracy. No, I'm not arguing that we should compel people to become Christians. You can't even do that, right? You can't force someone to become a Christian. You can't force someone to be born again. But what we see here in all of these passages in the Bible is that while all of us should obey the government almost all of the time, and we should all vote, some of you here, you might want to consider higher obligation, like serving in law enforcement. I've talked to Christians, they struggle, like, how could I do that? I might have to kill somebody. Or the military, joining the military. Like remember Romans 13, that the government is an avenger. It brings wrath on those who do evil, protecting the good and being God's instrument of wrath. That's what government is supposed to do. That is a good thing. Others should consider running for school board or town council or be a state and federal representative. Maybe it's giving money to a candidate or to a cause that gets us closer to God's standards. I have no idea what that would look like for you or me personally. But what we see in the Bible are examples of people who do more than just, I'm just praying and I'm going to vote. And secondly, why would we do this as Christians? We do this for this reason, that with Jesus' words in Mark 12:17, he didn't create a secular part of our lives and a sacred part of our lives, and both of those two things never interact. It's just the opposite. The things that belong to God are everything, meaning Jesus is the king over all kings. He's the Lord over all lords. That Jesus has a claim on everything. The sacred as well as the secular. All of it belongs to him. All of life is his. So if all of life is his, then the implications of Jesus' words when he says that give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that belong to God is this. Do you belong to God? That's the heart issue of this passage that this passage brings out, because the whole issue is one of authority. And when it comes to Christianity, that's not a side issue, that's the main issue. It's not just the authority of the government, it's the authority of God, and it's the authority of God over you. Do you recognize that? Do you embrace that? Do you submit to that? Or do you push it away? Do you know I'm in charge? No, I do what I want. No, I stand over the Bible and I'm the judge of the Bible. I'm the one who tells God what's right and wrong. Or is it like, no, you know what? I submit to God. Why? Because Jesus is incredible. Jesus is wonderful, and he's so worth my entire life that I will give him everything. I will submit everything. I belong to him. Why? Because the things that belong to God are everything, including me. We sang songs about it. Thank you, Jesus. Jesus, thank you. The Father's wrath completely satisfied. Why does he have wrath? Because we've defied his authority. And Jesus says, I'll take care of that. Give me your life. Submit your authority to mine. Become my follower, my servant. I'll be your Lord and Master. That's the hard issue in this passage. And it's easy to overlook with all this government stuff, but we can't miss that. That's key to everything in all of this. Let's pray. Jesus, what an incredible passage. Your words are so profound and they are so deep, and yet they're just 16 words and they're so simple. What takes us books and volumes to write, you say very succinctly and very clearly, and yet the implications are radical, far-reaching, and profound. And what it communicates to those with open hearts is that you are God, that you are in charge, that you are more than a mere man, and that the smartest thing we could do, the best thing we could do, would be to submit our authority to you. God, I know we talked about a lot of things today we talked about a lot of things today, period. But we talked a lot about things that people may not have thought of a lot about. And so I pray you would give clarity. I pray that you would give understanding in these things. God, if there's anything that I've said that has been against your word, I ask you please remove it from people's minds, except for the ones who will have the courage to confront me and show me the truth and help me understand where I've been wrong so that I can help us next week to see that and to make the correct changes. God, I just want to follow you. I want to think your thoughts after you on every issue, including our relationship to the state. So God, help us not just to understand these truths and nod our head and go, okay, that was good, yeah. But that we'd actually take it to heart and that we would actually change as a result. Do this, please, in us. Do this, please, through us. And do this not just for our own good as individuals, but for the good of our families, the good of our neighborhood, the good of our valley, the good of our state, and the good of our country. Do this, please, I pray. In your precious name, Jesus. Amen.